Good, good crowd here tonight. So you guys know where we're at? I'm pretty consistent. Romans, right? Romans, really good. And we've been here for quite a while now, haven't we? In this argumentation study, right? Paul is, a lot of people don't realize that Romans he's making a whole lot of arguments and he's bringing them all together. And we'll get to the culmination of the argument. But as he moves through these arguments, he makes a statement, and then he tries to explain the statement. And then he makes a statement, and then he tries to explain the statement. So a lot of times when you do an intense study like that, you lose the overall picture. So I try to explain a little bit each time, right? Like recap from last week, because a lot of us have really bad memories, this guy up here included, right? So Romans, the book is one word that's repeated over and over again in the book of Romans. And you guys know what that word is, right? Yeah, there we go. Good. I'm glad we got that. So like in our modern context, in our world today, we lose words, or by overuse or wrong use of words, we diminish the value of a word. And righteousness, a lot of times, just a hunch, like if you were to walk up to a stranger and say, what is righteousness? And they would say, it's the angel with the glow or something like that. They would say that it's some kind of glow about a person. And it's partly true, because righteousness has to deal with how we deal with other people. Like you can tell when you walk up to somebody, this person is trustworthy or untrustworthy. And Paul makes the argument in chapter 1 that, all of us have kind of messed up, right? We've done all these terrible things. We traded the identity that God gave us. He uses the word glory. But we've traded the identity that God gave us for the created things. And because we traded our identity that God gave us as his children, we became the most unnatural things in all of creation. Right? So he moves on from there, and it's a conviction point. He convicts this side of the room, the middle of the room, and then that side of the room. Because he moves on from there, and he says, the Gentiles didn't have the law, but you Jews, you had the law, and how well did you do at being the most natural things in all of creation, and living up to the identity that God gave you as a human being, right? And pass or fail, right? Fail. For all have fallen short of the glory of God. None have sought after. Then he moves on into this argumentation, and last week we talked about how his conscience is bearing witness in the Holy Spirit, as he's saying that it's not him, it's not his descendancy or some kind of lineage that he has drawn this idea from. It's who he is. His identity has become. Because if you remember Paul's life story, he was the one who picked up the rod, right? And tried to persecute all the people that were Christians in the beginning, because he felt that they were a threat to his identity as a Jew, right? As a Hebrew Israelite descendant, he felt that they were the threat to who he was. So he picked up the rod and he went to strike them. And one of those days when he was going after them, I'm just paraphrasing Paul's story here. One of those days when he was going after and chasing them, strike them down because they were the biggest threat to his identity, he realized who he was truly made to be, right? And that blinded him, because he realized at that moment how blind he truly was. So when one of Jesus' disciples came to him and healed his eyes, he knew that his identity existed only in that person. And he's making the argument right here, okay? So last week we kind of went over how he starts making these comparisons. And it's awesome how he does this, because he's making the argument, and he ends the last one, if you guys remember, in verse 13. He says, Jacob I loved, and Esau I hated. So remember the crowd. I'm sorry, we're in chapter 9, and that's verse 13. Okay, that's the end of last week's argument. Sorry if you're not there or you're not caught up. So if you guys are there, just give a thumbs up or, all right. But last week, he was wrestling with this. That's funny. That word came to mind because it's Jacob and Esau, right? Jacob is the wrestler guy, okay? But before that, he moves to Israel. Not all those born in Israel are descendants of Israel or belong to Israel. Now, if you guys remember Jacob's story, Jacob was what? He was the second born, right? So he didn't have the birthright. And he was kind of sneaky, right? You guys know what Jacob's name means in Hebrew? It means heel grabber. Literally, it's the hand and a heel to grab, is usurper, like someone who wants to take the throne. That's the idea of Jacob's name. He is the heel grabber. And then one day he wrestles with God, and he grabs God's heel, and guess what? God changed his name, right? To the one who wrestles with God. Because he did wrestle with his brother, now he wrestles with God, and all of Israel and every descendant of Jacob is named after Jacob. They call themselves the people who wrestle with God, right? Because that's the idea. That's the beauty of the story, right? Is because these people, for all intents and purposes, seem like they're abandoned and forsaken and left, but they continue to wrestle with God and the idea. And, history, Exhibit A. So as he's making this argument, who do you think he's appealing to in the room? You've got the Gentiles who've been way out here, who just come now. They don't even know who Jacob is. And then you got these other Gentiles who've come to faith, baptized, believe that Jesus is the only way for salvation. They've joined the community. And then you've got the Jews who are part of this new community, who have put their identity in Jesus, right? So when Paul's making these arguments, you got to realize how beautiful the argument is, because he's appealing. If you remember in Romans chapter 9, I'm kind of talking over myself now. My head's swimming now because all these stories just start popping up. Because if you know anything about the Bible and you've studied it, all these things start to connect, right? All these storylines start to connect, and they culminate in one place. So the Jews who were sitting on this side of the room, they're like remembering Israel, right? Well, that was Jacob. And then he ends the line of argument with, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. Now, when God says that in that story in Genesis, that's toward the end of the story of Jacob. Okay? When he says that, it's toward the end of the story of Jacob. He's already been called Israel over and over again. But God remembers who he was and who Esau was, and he calls them by who they were, not who they've become. Okay? That'll become a little bit more clear as Paul moves through the next argument. But what he's doing is he's going backwards through time. You notice, he's Israel, Jacob, Esau, and then he's going to move in another crazy direction in the next line of argument. So without further ado, I will read verse 14, and then I'll end where the argument ends, right? I'm not going to tell you exactly where it ends, but I'll end where the argument ends. So he says, verse 14, what shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? By no means. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God, who has mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to the molder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory for the vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory? That's not a dramatic pause. That's together. For glory. Even us, whom he has called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. As he says in Hosea, those who were not my people, I will call my people. And her who was not my beloved, I will call my beloved. And in the very place where it is said to them, you are not my people, they will be called sons of the living God. And Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, though the number of sons of Israel be as the sand of the sea, only a remnant of them will be saved. For the Lord will carry out his sentence upon the earth, fully, without delay. And as Isaiah predicted, if the Lord of hosts had not left us offspring, we would have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah. Okay, so he moves on to a small little argument there. So we're going to go over that because that's more than enough, right? More than enough. So as Paul's moving through this, we'll go back to verse 14. As Paul's moving through this, he's making the case to these people over here. And I've said that before. He's divided the group into three sections. And over again, he's trying to get this section to realize the Jews, the ones who were born into the house of Israel, the circumcised group, he's trying to get them to realize that their role is to reflect the image of God in the world. That's their identity. That's their true identity. And these people over here are just still learning. They're like, let's say teenagers, okay? Just for the sake of argument. You've got the older people who know better are sitting over here, and they've messed up. I'm not saying, I'm just dividing the room that Paul's speaking to. You have the older people who have lived most of their lives, and they probably look down on these people who are in the middle group, like the teenagers. And then you have these babies, infants, who are sitting over here, who don't know their left hand from their right hand, right? Just a quote from Jonah, right? So when he's appealing, who do you think that his main appeal is to? Because he's talking about these stories and he's drawing these lines together. Who do you think the main person that he's appealing to is? Because these Israelites, or Hebrews, or Jews, or whatever you want to call them, or the older people in the group, right? They know these stories. They know. They've wrestled with God. And they know that they're in a losing battle because Paul has spent 9 chapters of this book telling us how bad we're losing the fight against God, right? He's telling us how bad we're losing that fight. In our attempt to be God, he's telling us that we are failing. That's what he spends 9 chapters doing. And these people sitting over here, as they're thinking about the stories that they were raised on, as babies and as teenagers, and this new community they've been invited into, do you think that they feel like they've failed? Absolutely. I mean, I would. But Paul's just spent 9 chapters just beating me over the head with a stick about how terrible I am. And each one of those chapters I moved through, I realized that the standard, right, that God has placed before me, the only human that was truly human, how short I fall of being that person. It doesn't matter how old I am or how young I am, how short I fall of being Jesus and reflecting the image of God into the world. So when I think about that, and if I'm sitting in those people's seat, right? Because you have to put yourself in those people's seat and where they're sitting. Because they're in the most persecuted church in the world at the time. The Roman church was the most under persecution. I mean, they watched their brothers and sisters being hung from being made into street lamps, right? They watched them being fed to lions. They watched just the most ruthless and uncompassionate people just destroying them. And I can imagine their prayer every day would be like, God, come. God, come today, because we're dying. Our blood is being shed day and night, like he said in the last chapter. Because who are we? Does the world accept who we are? Because we tell them the opposite, right? The world says, go out and do whatever you want to do. Whatever feels good, that's right. And what do we say? That's not right. You're affecting the people around you. You're destroying relationships. That's what's right, is living in right relationship with not only the people around you, but the God above you. Because if you remember when they asked Jesus what the most important law is, what was that? With heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. He said the second is like the first, right? In that you can't do one without the other. Amen? Okay, and we realize that. How well do we do? If I was to put myself up on a stage here and be honest with everyone, how well do I do at that? Not too good. I mean, you guys be the judge. When you sit in the judgment seat and you look at your own lives, because sometimes we have to do that. I think there is real value in sitting and realizing what kind of person I am and not looking at myself as I am a stranger to myself and judging my own actions. And when I look at it and I realize what kind of person I am, I realize that I can't do this alone. That every mistake that I've made is usually with my own hands, and I'm going to do it my way, like Frank Sinatra says, right? I did it my way. That's what he says. But we can't do that. That's not who we are. We live in community, don't we? He's called us into community. I mean, if Jesus just walked around by himself and did what he did, then I'd say, yeah, sure. But people who have that pickup truck theology, have you guys heard what pickup truck theology is? It's like me and my pickup truck and Jesus, and that's it. That's all I need. I'm an island. I got Jesus, I got my radio, I got my pickup truck. I used to be there, right? Just a little confession. That's how I came up with pickup truck theology. It was me, Jesus, and the world can just go burn, right? That was my theology. When I realized something, I realized that Jesus called these 12 guys who just came from nowhere. It looked like, for all intents and purposes, they had no potential whatsoever. And he turned them into the men who changed the world, right? That's what he did. Does it talk about how awesome they are or how awesome he is? Right? Because if you can take something without value that everyone else sees as garbage, and you can turn it into one of the most valuable things in all of creation, what does that say about you? Right? Jesus is awesome. That's what it says to me. So, anyway, moving on. He says, so he's talking about this, and then people are wrestling inside, because that's what happens when you get beat over and over again. I'm not worthy of this. I'm not worthy of this. I don't deserve this. You know what kind of person I am when people aren't watching? You know what I do to people? How I turn my head away from other people's pain and do all kinds of things that I don't want to do, because Paul's already mentioned that, hasn't he? Why is it that I do the things I don't want to do? Why is it? Because I'm wrestling back and forth. Realizing who I'm actually wrestling with allows not you to overcome, but Jesus to overcome you. So, he says, what shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? And then what does he follow that with? No way. Right? No way. You think God's unjust? Because that's what Job accused him of. Job accused God of injustice. Because Job, if you remember, speaking on righteousness, he's one of the righteous men of the Bible. God says it himself. He says, have you seen my servant Job? There's no one like him. He's the most righteous in all the land. And then what does God do? He's like, go, do whatever you want to him. Right? Does that mean God is unjust? No. God knows the end of the story. He knows that he's the one who carries justice in his hand, not us. And that's what Job had to realize. Because the beautiful thing about Job, I love the book of Job. Does anyone else like Job? I talk about Job a lot. I love it. I love it. It's filled with thick Hebrew poetry, like so dense. Like 20% of that book is we haven't even translated. Do you guys realize that? That Job is one of the books that we don't even have all the words for it. Like in some of the Hebrew poetry, it's words that haven't been used in millennia. But the beautiful thing about the story of Job is that he goes through all this stuff, this tragedy, and he spends all this time arguing with his friends. But to him, God is some far-off character, right? God is some far-off, foreign character. He's like a spiritual piggy bank. If I do this and I do that, guess what? God will do this and do that. That's who Job is. And I think some of us, maybe we feel that way, that if I commit the right sacrifices and I do the right things, that God's going to bend to my will, right? Funny. Good luck with that. So anyway, Anyway, Job, he's a good guy. He's a good guy. He says it over and over again to his friends. He tells them, if I saw a widow and an orphan and I didn't take them and shelter them in my house, then may God's full wrath fall upon my head. That's one of the parts in Job. That's what he says to one of his friends, Elihu. He says, let God bring this down on me. Then I deserve every bit of it. But then he says, but I haven't. So why am I suffering? And what everyone wants to hear in the book of Job is why people suffer, why good people suffer. But that's not what it answers, right? Because the real answer to that question, as you work your way toward the end of that book, is that Job doesn't know. He doesn't know what happened in heaven. He doesn't know the end of the story. He doesn't know God. He thinks he does. But the beautiful thing is that at the end of the story, chapter 36, I believe, God shows up. And now guess who he knows? God. And he's right there in his face. How many people get that experience? Right? And do you think Job cared about all the stuff he lost when he saw God? Because he had very few words to say. God says, stand up to me like a man and answer me like a man. And what is Job's response? I'm just a little man. I'm just a little man. You're so big. I can't, this is too big for me. But God showed up. Right? God showed up. God knew the end of the story, that him and Job, it wasn't like, I'm going to sacrifice 10 bulls today and get the things that I need. It was like, hey, Dad, are you with me today? It became a relationship. Do you realize that at the end of the story of Job, that his friends committed the sacrifice to him, and you only commit sacrifice to God. So God turned Job into the example that they should be living by through the things that he suffered in his life. If that doesn't have gospel wrote all over it, I don't know what does. Okay, so I went off on a rabbi trail there, right? But anyway, Job, did he suffer injustice? No, because who showed up? God. Because a lot of times we get stuck in this idea that we are the ones who are the almighty creator of the universe. We're the grand arbiter of what's good and evil, all right? That's what our first mistake was. Congratulations, mankind. You think you know the beginning from the end. You don't. You don't. You're not omniscient beings. And if there's anyone in here that is an omniscient being, you can take the podium from, okay? Because you don't know the end of your story. You don't know. And the things that we don't know, we fear. And the things that we fear, we seek to destroy. So that's what we end up doing. We end up thinking, okay, these new people, and I'm going to bring it back to the people that he's talking to in the church. The older people in the church, this is the one thing Paul fought over and over again, is this division that happens in the church. New people come into the church, and maybe they're not living right. Maybe they're doing something. Or maybe there's always something to isolate them and try to push them out because they've become a threat to who you are in the chair that you sit in. Right? And what have you made yourself in doing so? You've turned yourself into the moral arbiter of the universe. Because who was it who invited that person into the church in the first place? You? Are you the one who holds the rod of justice and injustice in your hand? Interesting. Right. I like to ask a lot of questions like Paul does. So as they're sitting there thinking about it, so he says, well, what does God say to Moses? He says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. Okay? What's really good, Paul is a genius, okay? Paul is a genius. He's up there. He's like top 10 for me with geniuses because he's talking directly to the audience who knows all the stories of the Bible. Now, how many of you know where this happens in the Bible? I will have compassion on who I have compassion, and I will have mercy on who I have mercy on. It does happen in Exodus. That's good. Yep, it does. Okay, so for everyone else who doesn't know, right, I'll bring everybody together. We're all one family here, right, guys? Right? So I'll bring everybody together, and this may cost me a little bit of time. I might not get as far as I wanted to. It's important that we live righteously, right? So that means together in right relationship. So in Exodus, there's a story, and the Jews had just been brought out of captivity, and they're like celebrating. It's great, right? Like, we've just been brought out of captivity, and they're celebrating. No, they're not celebrating. They come to this water that's salty, and then all of a sudden God makes it unsalty, right? He makes it unsalty for them, and then they're complaining about birds. All we have is this manna to eat, and they're griping about something else. And then Moses goes off. God says, Moses, I got some rules, right? I'm just paraphrasing for the sake of time, okay? He says, Moses, I got some rules. You got to come up to the mountain. Don't bring anybody up with you, just you. Come up to the mountain. So Moses comes up to the mountain, and God speaks to him, and he tells him, he says, okay, first of all, you shall not have any more gods. Does it start to ring a bell with anybody? Shall not have any more gods before me. I'm the only one. I'm the only one. I am your beloved, and you are mine, right? To quote Song of Songs, and to quote Paul here. But he says, he writes these rules out, and guess what happens? Moses has been gone, right? And God is up on the mountain with Moses. The adults are away, so what happens to the kids? Oh, yeah, they do a number, don't they? They're like, hey, Aaron, since you're the next in line, what are we supposed to do? And Aaron's like, I got an idea. Let's make a golden cow, right? So that we can go dance around it. And there's all kinds of stuff that happens in that story that, well, I could mention it, but they commit all kinds of sexual immorality. They do all kinds of terrible things. They break every rule that Moses is chiseling with a hammer and chisel onto stone tablets. It's the first time. Moses comes down, he's so angry, he shatters the tablets. Then God gets mad too, and guess what? It's time to punish the kids, so a lot of them disappear. I'm paraphrasing, okay? So I'm trying to get through a lot of Exodus here. So Moses and God are angry. They're both angry at these people who've done this golden calf thing. And then God says, all right, Moses, come back up the mountain, right, this time. But Moses is like, I can't do it. I can't do it anymore, God. These people, they're just terrible people. And God's like, well, what do you need, Moses? And Moses says, well, show me your face. Let me see you so that I can move on. Because I got to know who I'm attaching myself to and who I'm attaching my life to. And God says, okay. But this time, nobody can even touch the mountain. Nobody can even go around the mountain. And I need you to cut 2 stone tablets for me. Right? So Moses does what he says. He waits 3 days, right? Because he was unclean. He has to wait 3 days because he went down there and he got so mad at him. He did all kinds of stuff. Okay? He waits. He goes up the mountain. On the 7th day, God shows up. And this time, he says, Moses, you can't look at me because you'll die, right? Because I'm so awesome that you can't even live and look at me. So God puts him into a rock, right? He hides him with his own hand, and he passes by. But when he passes by, he says a phrase. He says something really interesting. And everyone thinks that the name of God is Yahweh, Yahweh, right? That's the Hebrew translation. In Hebrew, they translate it Adonai, Lord. In your Bibles, a lot of times, they'll translate it as Lord. In all caps, that's usually represented by the divine name of God, or what they call the divine name of God. And they held it sacred. And that for a long time, for thousands of years, they held it sacred. And it wasn't meant to be uttered in public. But that's not God's real name. Because Yahweh means He is, right? Ehweh means I am. But what God says after it is what His name really is. He says, I am that I am, a God, compassionate, merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and truth. But by no means will I hold the guilty unaccountable. And I will punish to the 3rd and 4th generation the sins of the fathers. That's what he says. When people say, what's God's name? I say, well, compassionate, merciful, graceful. Merciful, graceful. It's interchangeable. Compassionate, graceful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and truth. And there's only one person that I know, that I truly know, who embodies all those characteristics. You go read through the book of Matthew, you'll find every one of those words over and over again in reference to Jesus. especially with the feeding of the 5,000. He says, Jesus was moved with compassion, right? And he saw they're sick, and he moved among them, and he taught. So there's grace. He didn't get mad because he wanted to mourn his friend John the Baptist. John the Baptist had just died. He wanted to go mourn his friend. He didn't get angry, but he was abounding in the promise, the faithful covenantal promise of love that his Father had made with those people. And then he was full of truth because he taught them, and he taught his disciples. And when his disciples were moved with compassion, he took them by the hand and he said, well, what do you have to give them? Right? That story embodies everything that our God is. Every word that he has said that he is, there's the embodiment right there. Walking around 5,000 people in the wilderness. It's there, starving to death, but not of food, not for food. They're starving to death for something else. So he says, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and compassion on whom I have compassion. Do you see the beauty of what Paul's just done? He's referenced the story where God gives his true name to Moses, and he reveals himself to his people. Now, if you're a Jew who believes that Jesus is the embodiment of God on the earth, now how do you look at those people who are just maybe babies or teenagers? How do you see those people who have been invited into your family? If you're actually listening. Because some people, that's a hard thing to break, it's pride. Because it's the thing we put in front of us, and we think it's what shields us from the things that are going to change who we are. But ultimately, if you realize that you're the person that needs to change, then what does pride do? It ultimately prevents you from changing. You know, and as we get older, I'm getting older too. I have teenagers at home. I have 3 of them. But that's one thing that gets harder and harder for me to do is realize the places that I need to change in my own life and how I'm not living righteously. Amen? I hope you guys are with me on that because it's very valuable. So when you look at yourself, when you see yourself as a stranger looking at a stranger, how truly do you see yourself? When you evaluate your days and the decisions you made and the relationships that you currently have, how is that going? I have good news. There's good news. Jesus is always open. What is it that you can't tell a father who's always listening? Nothing. God's always there. He's listening. Right? And a lot of times we think that it's our place to change the world, right? I read the back of the book, guys. We're not the ones who change it. He's the one who changes it. So if I'm not the one who changes the world, then who is the one who's going to change me? Going to be me or my submission to who he is, the standard that God's placed before me, and all the places that I fall short. Excuse me. So he moves on. And I know that was a lot. That was a lot for that one little verse, but it's beautiful because all these things start to come together. Because what's the contrast that he makes? The next contrast, somebody tell me, it's right there. You got God, who says, I will have mercy on who I have mercy on. Now Paul's going to give you the opposite kind of example, right? He uses God and how God reveals himself to his people. Even after they made the golden calf and Moses wanted to wipe them all out, God shows how compassionate he is. And this time he's the one who writes on the tablets. Now, what's the opposite of God? Well, it's right there. Pharaoh, isn't it? Pharaoh. What is it? So, Pharaoh. Like, we look at people like Pharaoh a lot of times, right? And we did this Bible study. I know. It's all right, Marty. Other people need to hear it too. But Pharaoh is the opposite of God. If you remember the story, Paul is kind of moving back through time, right? And he's bringing up these examples. He's kind of going all over the place, kind of like somebody else I know, right? But he's moving through, and he says, Pharaoh. Here's Pharaoh. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. Okay, some other examples outside of Pharaoh would be, do you guys remember when Jesus is walking around, right? And this blind guy comes up to Jesus, And the disciples decided that time that, we're going to find out exactly why Jesus is healing blind people, right? And they say, well, Jesus, this guy's blind from birth. Whose sin was it? Was it his parents or his? Wrong question, right? Jesus gives them the right answer. Why? Why was this guy born blind? So that Jesus could heal him and reveal. Yeah, Jesus answers with reveal the glory of God. We know on this side of the cross that the glory of God was embodied in who? Jesus. So, what is it? That guy was born blind. And now, who came to him? It sounds like the story of Job a lot, doesn't it? Because this guy suffered his whole life. And now who came to him to alleviate his suffering? Does that make God the bad guy in the story? No. It just shows you how far God's willing to go for you, or for that blind guy, or for those 12 people that nobody even cared about, walking through the wilderness that we currently walk through. Okay? So here's Pharaoh. Pharaoh is this guy. Here's Pharaoh, and I could think of a million common examples. I don't know if I'm on TV right now. I'll say it anyway. But there's a lot of people that look at, pick a president, right? Pick one. Just pick one. And he could be your Pharaoh, the current one or the one before him. It doesn't matter. You could pick anybody you want to, anybody that you think is a tyrant, and you could look at that person and you could point out everything wrong with that person. Do you know that? You know why you could do that? You know the only reason you can do that? Because you already have that. Do you know that? Judgment is a mirror. Every time you point your finger, right? I know Pastor says it a lot. Every time you point your finger, 4 point back at you. But I would say every time you look at that person, you're looking into a mirror. And it's more comfortable to project your insecurities and the things that you do wrong on someone else than it is to actually accept them and ask God to help you change them. You know that? You think of Pharaoh, okay, because our God is an awesome God. In the book of Jeremiah, God specifically tells Jeremiah, do not pray for these people. You know why? Because God would forgive them. Do you know that? He knows that he would forgive them. That's his character. He can't go against his own character. So Pharaoh, every time Moses came to him, did he say, hey, Pharaoh, you just need to change your ways. You're doing this all wrong. Clearly, the decisions you've made up to this point have not got you to the place you want to be, Pharaoh. You need to change your ways. And you need to talk to my God. You need to have a conversation with him. Because he'll bring you right to your face and completely change your life and actually give you a life rather than the death that you're currently living. Do you think if Pharaoh fell to his face and repented to God and said, you know what? God, I've been wrong about everything. You're the one who's right about everything. Do you think the Exodus story would have happened? No, I don't think so. Because I know my God, and he's merciful. He's compassionate. He's slow to anger. He's abounding in steadfast love and truth. That's what I know. Yeah, I know. So these people, a lot of times, it's easy to point out the flaws of someone else, right? And I know this all too well. I know it all too well. I think everybody knows this one all too well. It's easy to point out everyone else's flaws. It's hard to acknowledge our own. Really hard. Because pride is like that shield we put in front of us, right? We can see through it. But it prevents us from ever being able to love anyone around us. Because we're afraid they're going to change who we are. Because the most important thing to who we are is what? The thing that I've made myself into. And it's an almost impossible thing to break. But God, the one who can shatter it into pieces. Okay, so moving on, again, I get off on those rabbi trails. So then he says, so then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. Because it's his sandbox, right? You could sum up this whole argument and say, well, it's God's sandbox. What do you think you're doing? You think you're going to change the sandbox, right? Do you think you have that much power? And if you do, well, good luck, right? Because, well, Pharaoh, pick one. Pick one. Pharaoh, Haman. I mean, we threw out a bunch of examples at Bible study. Pharaoh, Haman, Saul. Think of Joseph, Stalin, Hitler. Think of any one of those guys. Any one of those guys. How well did they do at changing the sandbox? Because I tell you what, they're just dust in history. But God is still here, still number one champ. They tried to kill him. Guess what? Came back. Okay, so he says, you will, and then he begins the argument. Okay, so Paul's really good. He says, you will say to me then, why does he still find fault? Yeah, okay, good question, right? Why does he still find fault? If God made me this way, okay, no, I hear this all the time, right? You hear this all the time, especially when you're having the conversation with people who are, what do you call it? There's a word I'm looking for. Gay pride, right? Like that thing, the gay pride crowd, right? The alphabet community, right? Anytime you have that conversation with them and you say you're not truly reflecting the image of God in the world because the ultimate end of your desire is your own destruction, right? The ultimate end of your desire is that there will never be any more children. If you got exactly what you wanted and you spread it all over the world, it would be the end of mankind. Really, it would be. It would be the death of every living human being on the planet because there wouldn't be any more new human beings on the planet, right? So every time I have that conversation, they say, well, God made me this way. Well, here's Paul digging into the argument. Well, how can he find fault in me? For who can resist his will? Okay, so here he goes, and he's going to rebut the argument. But who are you, O man, to answer back God? Will what is molded say to the molder, why have you made me this way? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? Okay, now a lot of times we look at that and we go, well, that's not really a good answer, is it? Because it's basically Paul saying that God made you this way, so how are you to say to him that, why did you make me this way? If that was true, if you were predestined into a cast already made, then why did Paul say, why do I do the things I don't want to do and do the things I, why does he say that? He's already made that statement. Well, the answer lies in the question and how carefully you're listening to the way that he answers the question. Because what is clay? So clay has some interesting characteristics. I actually taught myself how to make my own clay and how to mold my own pots and do those things. It's really cool and valuable. And if you don't want to learn the skill, I'll go ahead and teach you some things about it that translate into everyday life. The thing that's interesting about clay is that if I was to make a lump of clay, and let's say I made a little pot, okay, and I didn't like the way the pot was, guess what? I just add a little bit of water to it, and I reshape it. Did you know that? I reshape the clay. So here's the answer that Paul's giving, okay? In our modern Western terms, so he's not saying that you're cast into a mold because the clay is shaped with hands, right? You shape clay with hands. What he's saying is that when you say to God, how can I resist your will? You made me this way. You're copping out of your part of the responsibility. There's a cop out. You're saying, well, I'm not responsible because I like this or I like that. How can you blame me? You made me this way. And God's like, but my hands are molding you every day. Why aren't you listening? Why aren't you listening? If you don't like that part about you, come talk to me about it. Right? Like my kids, okay? And I use my kids a lot because that's the way God relates with all of us. I mean, I don't care how old you are, you're still a child in his eyes. And that's a good place to be, trust me, a very good place to be. Because with a child, you have patience, right, to a certain extent. Sometimes you get mad and you're like, okay, I'm taking away your toys. You got to go sit in timeout. Been there, done that, got the t-shirt. With a good father, your son, you want, let me try to use an example that's not arbitrary. Me and my son want to build a shed. But is it more important to me that he learns how to build a shed or that the shed gets built? That he learns, yes. That's what's more important to me. As a good father, I want him to be able to go fishing rather than have to go fishing for him. The end is not the justification for all the things that happen in between, okay? That's not the justification. The justification is that he will realize that I actually care about him enough that it's more important that he learns how to do it. So if I'm building a shed and I see him as someone who's there to help me, and guess what? I lose really quick. My patience. It goes out the window because I know how to build a shed. Why don't you know how to build a shed? What's wrong with you? Okay? If that was God's take, if that was his posture toward us as his children, guess what? We'd all be in trouble. But do you think God values more the relationship and what he's trying to teach us, or the end? He values the relationship more. Why do you think he put Job through those things? Okay, so if me and my son are building a shed, and I want him to learn how to build a shed, and I explain to him all the processes, and everyone's been at that point where there have been both points, both sides of that, both sides of the argument, but for some reason you never really connect in the middle. I want him to understand what a 2x4 is, what all these different things are in order to attach wood and do the things in order to construct a shed. I don't know why I picked a shed because it's so complex. I want him to learn all these things, but at the same time, I want him to be able to accomplish the project. Because sometimes teaching them is about the accomplishment of the project. But what I want him to do is when he makes a mistake, and like let's say he drives, instead of the nail, he drives the thumbnail, which I've had plenty of practice with this week. If he drives the thumbnail instead of the metal nail, right, the 16 instead of the thumb, if he drives the thumb, I want him to go, Dad, I messed up. Why did you? The wrong posture for my son to take would be to come to me and say, Dad, why would you ever give me a hammer? That's the wrong posture to take. You see what I'm saying? The same argument applies to people who are in the alphabet community. I call them the alphabet community. But anyway, the same posture applies. You were given desire, but you're using it the wrong way. Right? So why are you blaming the guy who gave you the hammer? He wants you to build something. You need to go talk to the guy who gave you the hammer. It's like walking around, it's like trying to assemble a baby crib without the instructions. Right? That's what everybody's trying to do. And they never even plan on having a baby. So it's like, what are you doing? Why are you trying to put all the square pegs in the round holes? Why do we do that? Because we think we know better. Pride, right? Pride is that thing that's right before us all the time. And we look at the story of Pharaoh and we say, oh, well, God hardened him so that he could give us the story of Exodus, right? But I would take the opposite kind of stance, posture, to look at that story. Because Pharaoh was unwilling to be changed. He was unwilling. God never opened the door, right? All Pharaoh saw was a big wall. God never opened the door for him. Thank God that most of us here today, I'm hoping all of us here today, God has opened that door and said, you need to change. He didn't make you the way that you think he made you. And that grace, that thing that he names himself as being, is his ability to see the potential of the person that you can be outside of the person that you think you are. Right? Because all that is right here. And what we do a lot of times is we say, oh, well, you know what? This is just the way that I am. Right? How many of us have made that phrase, that statement? This is the way that I am. If we're honest, I think everybody has. I'm just stubborn. That's how I'll always be, right? I don't like it, but that's what I'm going to be. I'm unwilling to change. That's just who I am, right? Well, Paul says, you're wrong, because who you're supposed to be is the guy who was up there. That's the standard. And if you miss that point, you're not human. Amen? So, here he is. He'll have mercy on who he has mercy on, and he'll harden whom he hardens. And when we say that term harden, what I think he means is that he's just not going to open the door. And that's the ultimate fear of God, is that he will leave us right where we are. Justly so, because you made the bed. Mercy is saying, you made the bed, but this is the right way to make the bed. Because you are better than this. How many people had that dad, right? You're better than this. Why do you keep doing it the wrong way? How many of you didn't like him when you were a teenager? Right? I raised 2 hands for that. And he's laughing at me in the back there. But do you think, if your dad really cares about you and he knows the person that you can be, do you think that out of love he pushes you to be the person that you're supposed to be? And a lot of times you say, why is it going to be so hard? Right? I can't change. I'm going to be this person forever. No, you won't. Because where does your hope lie? Is it in you, or is it the one who's changing? Amen? So I hear a lot of ruffling going out there, and I care about you guys. Please, please, I don't want to throw my Baptist brothers and sisters under the bus, but don't take the Baptist approach to this chapter. Because the Baptist approach is that everybody's cast into this mold. You're cast. You can't change. You can't change at all. It's like, but with God, what's possible? All things. Good. I love it. I love you guys. So I'll end with a word of prayer, and then we'll